Now we get into the physiology of labor. Now, labor is the process by which coordinated uterine contractions produce three things. So they produce the cervical ripening, which is basically effacement and dilatation. They also produce the descent and birth of the fetus, which is the ultimate result of the labor itself. They also produce the separation and delivery of the placenta and membranes. So, whenever we talk about normal labor, what is labor? It's the process by which coordinated uterine contractions produce three things. They produce a cervical ripening, effacement, and dilatation. So the cervix has to ripen, it has to efface, and it has to dilate. Then there will be descent and birth of the fetus. And after the fetus will be born, there will be separation and delivery of the placenta and membranes. Okay. So exact single event that initiates human labor is still not fully understood. Labor probably begins when several maternal, fetal, and placental processes collectively shift the uterus from a relatively inactive state to an excitable and contractile state. Now, the uterus during labor. The uterus during labor is undergoing myometrial contraction. Let's try to understand what myometrial contraction is. The myometrium is made of smooth muscle cells containing actin and myosin. Now, a contraction occurs when there is a rise in intracellular calcium, and this calcium binds to calmodulin, and then the myosin light chain kinase is activated, and then the actin and myosin interact, and the myometrial cell shortens. Okay, now there's some substances that increase the contraction of this uterus. Basically, oxytocin, prostaglandins, PGE2, PGF2 alpha, mechanical estrogen activity, and increased expression of oxytocin receptors and gap junctions. All of these different mechanisms basically increase this contraction. So, how can we increase this contraction, these myometrial contractions? We need oxytocin, we need prostaglandins, but particularly PGE2 and PGF2 alpha. We need some mechanical stretching of the uterus, we need increased estrogen activity, and we need increased expression of the oxytocin receptors and the gap junctions. Okay. Also, there are some substances that promote relaxation. So they're doing the opposite thing. This is basically progesterone activity. Progesterone, if, as you studied, maintains the quiescent state of the uterus. Okay. So progesterone activity maintains the inactive state of the uterus. And some beta adrenergic stimulation also relaxes the uterus, and calcium channel blockers like nifedipine and some nitric oxide and uterine relaxing pathways. Therefore, prostaglandins and oxytocin increase extracellular calcium, while the calcium channel blockers lead to relaxation, right? So, since prostaglandin and oxytocin was increasing the intracellular calcium, it was increasing contraction, and the calcium channel blockers were doing the opposite thing, right? So the calcium channel blockers and beta adrenergic drugs and calcium channel blockers basically reduce the calcium entry or contractile activity. Okay, moving on to the second thing, we're going to look at the retraction. Retraction is a special feature of the uterine muscle. Okay, the uterine muscle has this special thing that it can retract. Retraction is basically retract, right? So the normal muscle returns almost completely to its original length after contraction. Okay, so there is an upper uterine myometrium and there's a lower uterine myometrium. So when we talk about relaxation, you can see that the uterus has an upper uterine myometrium and a lower uterine myometrium, right? So what happens to this upper uterine myometrium? It behaves differently. After each contraction, its fibers remain slightly shorter and thicker than before. The persistent shortening is called retraction. Okay, so let me just punch this here. What happens in the upper state? In the upper uterine myometrium, what happens to the fiber? After each contraction, the fibers remain slightly shorter and thicker than before. This is happening to the upper uterine myometrium fibers. Okay, this persistent shortening is called retraction. Now let's understand what contraction versus relaxation is. Contraction is when there is a temporary shortening. It occurs during the contraction. It's followed by relaxation. But retraction is something different. Okay, retraction is a persistent shortening after the contraction. It mainly affects the upper uterine segment and it accumulates with successive contraction. Now, why is retraction important? Because try to understand that over time, retraction thickens the upper uterine segment, right? So one after the other retraction is going to thicken this upper uterine segment, right? And it's going to pull the lower uterine segment and cervix upward. Okay, so this is going to be pulled upward due to this retraction, right? This contributes to cervical effacement. It also assists cervical dilatation. It pushes the fetus downward. Since it's constantly contracting, the fibers are getting thicker and the fibers are also getting slightly shorter. The retraction is basically pushing the fetus downward. So whatever the fetus here will be pushed downwards, the lower uterus will be the lower uterine segment and cervix will be pulled upward, and due to that there will be cervical effacement and dilatation also. It's going to reduce the uterine cavity after delivery. So there's spontaneous reduction of the uterine cavity after delivery, and it also compresses the maternal blood vessels after placental separation. Okay, the last function contributes to postpartum hemostasis, the so-called living ligature effect of the myometrium. Okay, so that's something about the upper and lower uterine segments. Now, the upper and lower uterine segments during labor, the uterus becomes functionally divided into two parts. We saw this upper uterine segment and the lower uterine segment. Okay, so the upper uterine segment contains most of the actively contracting and retracting muscle. It becomes progressively thicker, it shortens and exerts downward force on the fetus, and it pulls the cervix and lower segment upward over the presenting part, right? So that is something about the upper uterine segment. Okay, so all of this upper uterine segment basically contains most of the actively contractile and retracting part. It becomes progressively thicker. It exerts downward force on the fetus and it pulls the cervix and lower segment upwards over the presenting part. The lower uterine segment is formed mainly from the uterine isthmus and the lower body. It becomes progressively thinner and it stretches to accommodate the descending presenting part, and it offers less resistance to descent. So look at this lower uterine segment here. It's formed mainly from the uterine isthmus and lower uterine body. It becomes progressively thinner. It stretches to accommodate the descending presenting part, and it offers less resistance to descent. Thus, the upper segment contracts and retracts while the lower segment stretches and thins out. So, in obstructive labor, something important happens. In obstructed labor, an abnormal ridge may develop between this thick upper segment and the thin lower segment. So, this ridge uh, happens in obstructed labor. Okay, so what happens is there's a thick upper segment and an overstretched lower segment, and this pathological retraction is called a Bandel's ring. And this is basically an obstetric emergency sign. You have to treat this as an obstetric emergency. Okay, so the band is going to be present here between the upper and lower uterine segment. Okay, now, there's something called as fundal dominance, right? Fundal dominance basically says that each uterine contraction starts in the fundus near one of the cornua and spreads across and downwards. Okay, so that's what basically fundal dominance is. Can you see each uterine contraction starts in the fundus near one of the cornua and spreads across and downwards. Each contraction is longest and intense in the fundus, but the peak is reached simultaneously over the whole uterus and fades from all parts together. This pattern permits the cervix to dilate and the fundus to expel the fetus. So this is how fundal dominance works, right? Normally, contractions usually begin in near the uterine cornua or the fundal pacemaker region. This is the uterine cornua or the fundal pacemaker region. The contraction spreads downwards. Can you see that it's slowly spreading downwards? The fundus contracts more strongly and for longer than the lower segment. The contraction reaches its peak in a coordinated manner. This pattern is called fundal dominance. There must also be functional coordination between the upper and lower segments. The upper segment contracts, the lower segment relaxes and stretches. This coordinated relationship is called uterine polarity. So, what is uterine polarity? Uterine polarity is that the upper segment is contracting and the lower segment is relaxing and stretching, right? And the fundal dominance was that you know how the cardiac cells had the SA node and the AV node starting the signal for contraction. Just similarly, there is the uterine conua, which is starting the uterine contraction. And then slowly that contraction is spreading downwards. The fundus contracts more strongly and for longer than the lower segment. The contraction reaches its peak in a coordinated manner. So you can see it starts from the cornua and then slowly spreads downwards to the entire uterus, right? This is a pattern. This is called fundal dominance. This basically pattern is called fundal dominance. There must also be functional coordination between the upper and lower segments. The upper segment contracts, the lower segment relaxes and stretches. This coordinated relationship is called uterine polarity. Right? Although a functional pacemaker region is believed to exist, a single anatomically identifiable pacemaker has not been conclusively demonstrated like in the heart muscle. Okay, now we have gap junctions and functional syncytium. Okay, this is very similar to the heart muscle, by the way. During most of pregnancy, individual myometrial cells are relatively poorly electrically connected. So during pregnancy, they are not electrically connected. But what happens near term? Near term, gap junctions increase in number and size. So we were studying about gap junctions and functional syncytium, and I said during most of pregnancy, individual myometrial cells are relatively poorly electrically connected, right? But what happens near term? Near term gap junctions increase in number and size, electrical impulses pass more easily between cells, contractions become coordinated, the uterus begins to behave like a functional syncytium. Important gap junction proteins include connexins, particularly connexin 43. Estrogen and prostaglandins promote this coordinated state, whereas progesterone activity helps maintain uterine quiescence during pregnancy. Right? So progesterone and estrogens are somehow doing the complete opposite thing, right? Then we have cervical effacement. What is cervical effacement? Cervical effacement basically means shortening and thinning of the cervix as it becomes incorporated into the lower uterine segment. So let me just punch that here. What is effacement? Ooh, ooh, sorry. Okay, so can you see that effacement means shortening and thinning of the cervix as it becomes incorporated into the lower uterine segment? Before labor, the cervix is long, it's firm, it's closed, and it's directed relatively posteriorly. But during effacement, the internal os is drawn upwards and the cervical canal becomes progressively shorter. I'll repeat that during effacement, the internal os is drawn upwards and the cervical canal becomes progressively shorter. Effacement may be expressed as a cervical length in centimeters or a percentage from 0% to 100%. There are four examples. So you can see, I'll give you some examples here. So technically, if it's 0% effaced, you know that it's a long cervix. If it's 50% effaced, it's approximately half shortened. And if it's 100% effaced, it means it's completely taken up. So let me put these examples of cervical effacement here. If it's 0% effaced, we say it's a long cervix. If it's 50% effaced, we say it's approximately half shortened. And if it's 100% effaced, we say that it's completely taken up. Now, there's a distinction between nulliparous versus multiparous women. In nulliparous women, a woman who's having pregnancy for the first time, effacement tends to precede major dilatation. So, effacement happens first and major dilatation happens later. But in multiparous women, the effacement and dilatation may occur together. This remains a useful description, but the actual sequence varies between some individuals. Right? Now we talk about cervical ripening. Cervical ripening is basically before contractions can efficiently dilate the cervix undergoes ripening. Okay, so before any contractions can efficiently dilate the cervix undergoes ripening, and cervical ripening is primarily an inflammatory and extracellular remodeling process rather than any simpler muscular relaxation. Okay, so can you see here that cervical ripening is an inflammatory and extracellular matrix remodeling process rather than simply a muscular relaxation? There are some changes that we're going to study that happen here. So when I talk about cervical ripening, we're going to see some processes that happen here. Okay, let's see what those are. So there is disruption and redistribution of collagen fibers. Okay, and then there's reduced collagen concentration and organization. There's increased collagen breakdown. There's increased matrix metalloproteinase activity. There's an alteration in proteoglycans. There's an increased hyaluronic acid, increased water content, and then leukocyte and inflammatory mediator activity, and also an increased softness and distensibility. All of these lead to cervical ripening. Dermatan sulfate decreases while more hydrophilic molecules, including hyaluronic acid, increase. The cervix therefore becomes more softer and more capable of effacement and dilating. Okay, so remember that dermatan sulfate decreases while more hydrophilic molecules, including hyaluronic acid, increase. The cervix therefore becomes softer and more capable of effacing and dilating. Prostaglandins are very important mediators of the cervical lining. This explains how prostaglandin preparations can be used clinically for cervical ripening and induction of labor. Then we have cervical dilatation. Okay, now, what is cervical dilatation? Dilatation means opening of the cervical os from closed to approximately 10 centimeters, allowing the passage of the fetal head. That itself means cervical dilatation. So we're going from all the way from the closed cervical os, we're going all the way up to a 10 centimeter dilatation, allowing passage of the fetal head. That's your cervical dilatation. Okay, this is cervical dilatation. It occurs through a combined effect of upward traction produced by the upper segment retraction. Also, there's direct pressure from the presenting part. There's also hydrostatic pressure from the intact forewaters, and is also repeated uterine contractions and also this progressive cervical ripening. So a lot of things are happening together that lead to cervical dilatation. There's upward traction produced by the upper segment retraction. There's direct pressure from the presenting part of the fetus. The increased hydrostatic pressure from the intact forewaters also contributes to this. Also, there's repeated uterine contractions and there's progressive cervical ripening. Now, there's the role of the four waters that we'll mention here. When the membranes are intact, the amniotic membrane fluid in front of the presenting part forms the four waters. During a contraction, the four waters act like a hydrostatic wedge against the cervix and they help promote dilatation. After rupture of membranes, the presenting part itself applies to the cervix. Okay, so the four waters are basically there's this whenever the membranes are intact, the amniotic fluid in front of the presenting part forms the four waters, right? So during a contraction, the four waters act like a hydrostatic wedge against the cervix, and it helps promote dilatation. After rupture of these membranes, the presenting part itself applies pressure to the cervix. Okay. Okay, so now we look at the hormonal and biochemical regulation of labor. We have progesterone, we have estrogen, and we have prostaglandins. I'll stop the video here and start from hormonal and biochemical regulation in the next video.